Okay, so this is our first episode on Marx and Marxism. And the two figures that we're really concentrating here are these guys. It's Marx on the left and Engels on the right. Obviously very keen on beards. Engels was a very significant social theorist in his own right. And he was also, as it were, the money behind the operation. He was a businessman that supplied Marx with a lot of the money that he needed to conduct his work. Okay, so one way of thinking about what's going on with these thinkers is that, we saw in previous episodes that Mill and Pareto, a problem with Mill and Pareto's view is they take the status quo for granted. Well, Marx is all about criticizing it, right? So while Mill and Pareto took the status quo for granted, Marx's whole theory is based on the idea that we're going to criticize the status quo. We're going to examine the status quo and we're going to show what's wrong with it. Okay, now one problem with studying Marx today is that a lot of people would say that, Marx has become an irrelevance in the modern world. And there are a number of reasons for this. I mean, the most obvious reason would be the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, around the early 1990s. And it's certainly true that before that period, Marx was studied a lot more than he, in universities than he is now. So when I first started studying as an undergraduate, the Soviet Union still existed, and Eastern Europe was still behind the Iron Curtain and so on. And so one might study this material as a way of trying to understand what was going on in those countries, although how useful this would be to understanding what actually happened there is another matter, as we'll see. But those countries they've all gone now. They may still exist, but they're no longer communist. And even countries like China, which still claims to be communist, pretty clearly isn't. I mean, if you go to Shanghai, not now because all shut down, but actually no, it's kind of opened up just recently. But if you go to Shanghai or Beijing, you won't see communism in operation there. You see a kind of state-run capitalism. So Marx's theory is not as politically relevant as it used to be. What's more, Marx made a number of predictions, and the most important one being that capitalism would collapse and be replaced by communism. And he made these predictions a number of times in his lifetime. It was supposed to happen in 1830, it was supposed to happen in 1848, and it was supposed to happen in 1870, but it never actually happened, and it still hasn't happened, right? So one might say, look, his whole theory is based on this idea that capitalism would collapse and communism would come, but it hasn't happened. So, his history has proven his theory to be wrong. So what's the point of studying it? One might additionally point out that there's been lots of criticism of Marx's view, and indeed, probably most of this criticism and the harshest of this criticism has actually come from the left. So what's the point of studying this anymore? Well, in his textbook, that I've set for this course, Ian Shapiro gives two reasons. The first is this. He says, look, and I think these are good reasons. The first thing he says is, look, the issue isn't whether Marx made mistakes. Of course he made mistakes. Every theorist makes mistakes. The issue isn't whether he makes mistakes. The issue is whether he's right about something, right? And whether that something is illuminating. Right, so yes, he got his predictions were incorrect. Of course, that's true. But maybe he's nevertheless, even though he got that wrong, he's right about something important. So it's worth studying him to see if that's true. The second point Shapiro makes is that Marx has been extremely influential and continues to be extremely influential. He's at the head of a tradition that has provided the most sustained criticism of liberalism that we have. And it's worth studying him for that reason alone. So I think that those are good reasons, but there's another couple of reasons that I want to give as well. The first is that, we might as well just come clean and say there's no question about this. Marx is clearly the most important social thinker in history. No one even comes close. That doesn't mean that he's right, of course. He could be wrong, but he could be wrong about everything, but he's still the most important social thinker who has ever lived by a country mile. No one comes close. The second thing is what I would say, and we'll see this as we go through this material, I would say that Marx is wrong. There are people who deny this. There's people who still think that Marx is right. The revolution to communism is just coming. It's just around the corner. But I don't believe that myself. Well, put it this way. I don't believe that we can make predictions of this kind about the future. We just don't know enough. So I think Marx is wrong. But I still think that Marx's theory is the key to understanding the modern world. So I would say if you want to understand the modern world, what you have to do is figure out exactly why Marx was wrong. You have to figure out exactly why he's wrong. It's not enough to just point out that he got his predictions wrong. You have to figure out exactly why his predictions turned out to be incorrect. If you figure that out, then you'll really understand the modern world. And my own view is that not many people have given this the thought that it deserves. Anyway, we'll see why I think that as we go through the course. Now, naturally, Marx has a large and complicated theory, and we're only really going to scratch the surface of it here. We're going to look at the things that I think are most important in a course that deals with justice. Okay, and we begin with, as Marx's theory begins, with what Marx takes to be the key feature of human nature, if I can put it that way. Marx probably wouldn't have liked to speak about human nature, and Marxists today wouldn't. But anyway, let's just use that term for the sake of it at the moment. Marx begins with what he takes to be the key feature of human nature. Now, we haven't made much of this, but we've seen other theorists rely on a similar concept. So for Hobbes, the key feature of human nature was that in the state of nature, naturally, we're all equal and vulnerable. So we're all vulnerable to each other. No one's so powerful naturally that they're able to completely dominate others so that they remove the risk of, for example, being killed by them. So for Hobbes, the key feature of human nature, his starting point for thinking about politics, is that human beings are naturally equal and vulnerable. For Locke, the key starting point, the key feature of human nature is that we are the property of God. For Bentham, the key feature of human nature is that we're all pleasure seekers. For Mill and for Pareto, the key feature of human nature is that we seek for our own happiness, the maximization of our utility function. For Marx, the key feature of human nature is that we produce the means of our own subsistence. Okay, we produce the means of our own subsistence. We make stuff that we live by. Okay, we produce our own food, we produce shelter, we produce clothing and so on. We produce the means of our own subsistence. If you want to understand human beings and in the society, in the social relations that they have, that's the key thing. The key thing is that we produce the means of our own subsistence. And for Marx, history's epochs are characterized by changes in the basic structure of how that's done. Changes in the basic structure of how it is that we produce the means of our own subsistence. Okay, and I'm just going to look at this quickly now, although later in the course we're going to go into this in more detail. So Marx argues that in every society, or at least in every society except the last one yet to happen, communism, in every society that's existed, there are two key classes of people. There may be other classes, but there are two key ones. There are two important ones. The first class is the class of the people who produce, and the second class is the class of the people who control production. Okay, so there's always two classes, right? The class of people who produce and the class of people who control production. So, for example, in a slave-based society, such as that existed in the ancient world, the slaves produce, and the products of their production go to the slave owners. The slave and the slave owner has to maintain the slaves, but the slave owner keeps the surplus. So there, in those kinds of societies, slave owning societies, best not to think of the southern United States here, because that was a mixed system. It wasn't a pure slave owning society. It's a very complicated story there, but don't worry, we're talking about the ancient world, really. Right? There are slaves. The two key classes are the slaves and the slave owners. The slaves do the work, they produce, and the slave owners keep the product of the slaves' work, out of which they have to pay for the upkeep of the slaves. They have to feed them, and so on. Okay. In a feudal society, on the other hand, there are lords and serfs. The serf produces. The serf retains some of the product that the serf produces, but must also work for the lord, and the lord keeps the surplus. In a capitalist society, the workers produce, the capitalists pay the workers, and the capitalists keep the surplus. Okay, so there's always two key classes in any of these societies. In the slave-owning society, it's the slaves and the slave owners. In the feudal society, it's lords and serfs. And in capitalist societies, it's workers and capitalists. And there's always this distinction between the class that produces, the slaves, the serfs, the workers, and the class that controls the production, the slave owner, the lord, and the capitalist. Okay. All right. So here we see the concept of surplus value. Surplus value is the value that the producers produce that's kept by the class that controls production. Okay, so just to repeat that again. Surplus value is the value that's kept by the class that controls production, though it's produced by the producers. Okay, so it's the value that the slave owners keep for themselves as a result of the work of the slaves. It's the value that the lords keep that is produced by the serfs. It's the value that the capitalist keeps that's produced by the workers. And this, and here's a very important term for Marx, this is exploitation. The retention by the controlling class of the surplus value is exploitation. The exploitation is taking from the producers part of the value of their production. So exploitation is taking from the people who actually produce part of the value of their production. And what is justice? Justice is the elimination of exploitation. Okay, so maybe I should go through that once more. Exploitation occurs when the producers produce, and then the people who control the production take some of that value away. That's exploitation. And justice is the elimination of exploitation. Okay, now for Marx, every system of production, whether it's slavery, whether it's feudalism, whether it's capitalism, every system of production has tensions within it. And these tensions develop over time, right? So they get bigger and bigger. The tensions increase over time, eventually undermining the system, which leads to a revolution to a new system. So, for example, under feudalism, slowly over time, capitalism developed. Traders, merchants grew, and it turned out that they produced far more efficiently than the lords did, and so eventually they took over, and capitalism became the dominant force in the world. So we'll come back to this, but the idea is that within any economic structure develops a competing economic structure that will eventually overthrow the existing economic structure. So just to a little prequel of what we're going to see later, feudalism developed in a traditional slave-owning society and eventually replaced it. In a feudal society, capitalism grew and eventually replaced it. And the idea is that communism will eventually replace capitalism because capitalism will collapse under the tensions that it itself creates. We'll talk about that in much more detail later. But this whole big picture, the idea that history develops because of the socio-economic forces driving it, is called historical materialism. Right, that's Marx's term for this, historical materialism. I mean, what does historical materialism mean? It means that the material stuff, the physical stuff drives history. Right, historical materialism. It's not what's going on up here that drives history. Right, it's changes in the socio-economic reality that drives history. In particular, changes in the means of production drive history. Socio-economic forces are what matter. Now, Marx is sometimes accused, in fact, lots of Marxists for many years believed, and this was sort of the standard received view of Marx for a long time, was that this meant that Marx believed in a kind of historical determinism. That is, that what goes on up here makes no difference to anything. It's just, we're just determined by socio-economic forces. The whole of history is determined by socio-economic forces, and people's ideas don't make any difference. So in other words, there's no role for human agency in history. Our freedom doesn't make any difference at all. Free will is irrelevant, right? If it exists. It's irrelevant. Everything is determined by socio-economic forces. And I think that that's not Marx's view. Marx has a much more subtle view. I mean, I think that view is patently false, but that's not Marx's view. Marx has a much more interesting and enlightening view than that. And I think the best way to explain it is to give an example. This example I actually pinched from a Marxist theorist called Jerry Cohen, who died reasonably recently. We're going to meet him again later in the course. And I actually discovered this, ironically, for reasons that you'll see in a second. I discovered this example while out walking, listening to Jerry Cohen give a lecture on my cell phone. Okay, and the example is about cell phones. So when cell phones first became a thing, I was determined not to get one. I absolutely made up my mind that I didn't want one. I didn't want people ringing me all the time. I hate telephones. The last thing I want to do is speak to someone on the phone. I absolutely hate it. The idea that someone could just call me wherever I was just the worst thing I could imagine. Just terrible. So I didn't have one. For years and years, while everybody else had them, I just didn't want one and was determined not to get one. And indeed was really rather proud of myself for not having one. But then one day, and I was living in Germany, and I was living in Munich, and I had arranged to meet a friend to go and see Bayern Munich play football, and it was a really important occasion because it was the last day that they were going to play in the stadium that they traditionally played in. I can't remember what it was called now, but they've since the World Cup was held in Germany, they've moved to a new stadium. And we'd arranged to meet at the U-Bahn stop, the metro stop near the ground. And turns out what we'd agreed is, we would get there on the train, exit the train, turn right, go up the stairs, exit, meet at the top. So I got out of the train, turned left, went up the stairs and stood there waiting and couldn't find my friend. I waited for 45 minutes, whatever it was. No one's around, and ended up just going home as he did too. And he was for me, it was the first time so I've never seen Bayern München play. It was my first chance to see them. I never did, but he was a hardcore fan. He would go every week, and he was very upset at the fact that he missed the game. Very upset indeed. Anyway, I was very embarrassed by this and very upset about it. And I bought the guy some wine and so forth to try and make up for it, and he eventually forgave me. But at that point, I realised that I had to get a phone, because if I had a phone, I could have just called him and we would have fixed this. This problem just wouldn't have existed. We would have just worked out that we'd gone to different exits and would have met up and gone to watch the game, and everything would have been fine. what I came to realize is that people had begun to rely on their phones to such an extent that it was very difficult for me not to have one anymore. I mean, if neither of us had a mobile phone, we would have been much clearer about where it was we were supposed to meet. But because he had a phone, and because he if he was meeting anybody else, he would have just been able to call them if there had been a problem. He was not as careful, and I wasn't as careful as we would otherwise have been. So I just got to the point where I realized, look, if I'm going to actually get on with people in the world now, I'm going to have to get a phone, and I did. Now, and I've had one ever since. In fact, I'm filming this on a mobile phone at the moment. And now I'm just like everybody else. I go everywhere with the phone. I'm hardly ever without it. I've become exactly the person I didn't want to be, right? And this I think is a really good example of what Marx is talking about. If you want to know why I have a phone, well, I freely chose to get one. Right? I wasn't determined by historical forces, by socioeconomic forces to buy one. It wasn't as if socioeconomic forces held a gun to my head and forced me to go along to that shop that I did in central Munich and buy a phone. It wasn't like that at all. I mean, I was completely free. I made my own free choice to buy a phone, but the socioeconomic forces, the historical forces, made it inevitable that I would get one. But I could have waited another week, or I could have waited another month. Maybe I could have held out for another year. But basically, the socio-economic reality made it inevitable that I would get one. And I think you can see Marx saying this in this passage. Man makes his own history, but he does not make it out of the whole cloth. He does not make it out of conditions chosen by himself, but out of such as he finds close at hand. And that's what happened to me with the mobile phone. But I made my own history. I chose to go down to that shop on Sonnenstrasse and buy that phone. I made my own history, but I didn't make it out of the whole cloth. I made it out of conditions not chosen by myself, but conditions that were, how does he put it, close at hand. Like everyone else was relying on other people having mobile phones, and so I found that I had to get one as well. Okay, all right, so that's a picture of Marx's historical materialism. It doesn't involve determinism, I don't think. We're not compelled. We do have free will. We're able to make our own choices. But the world makes certain choices inevitable. And Marx would say that the big picture of history's big picture, is driven by socio-economic forces and not by our choices. Okay, right. In the next episode, we're going to talk more about Marx's understanding of capitalism.